New York, April 1912. The streets buzz with the most shocking news of the decade. The unsinkable Titanic lies at the bottom of the North Atlantic, taking with it more than 1,500 souls. While the world still tries to process the magnitude of this tragedy, in the noisy offices of the New York Herald, a 26-year-old journalist named Charles Munro sees only one thing in this catastrophe: the opportunity of his lifetime. Charles is not like other reporters. He is ambitious, calculating, and possesses an almost cruel ability to transform human tragedies into headlines that sell newspapers. For him, tears are just ink on paper, and pain is just a story waiting to be told. On that cold April morning, when his editor calls him for an urgent meeting, Charles already knows his luck is about to change. "Munro," says the editor, tapping his impatient fingers on the table covered with telegrams and blurred photographs of the wreck. "I need you to go to the port. The survivors from the Carpathia are arriving tonight. Everyone wants the same thing: tears, drama, stories of heroes and cowards. But I want something different. I want something that will make this country stop breathing when they read our front page." Charles smiles with that confident smile that always irritated his colleagues. "And what would that be, exactly?" "That's what you're going to find out. Find an angle that nobody else has. Find something that shocks, that turns people's stomachs, that makes them question everything. I don't care if you have to make it up, but bring me a story that will make history." And so, with this mission in hand and his heart full of ambition, Charles Munro heads toward Pier 54, where hundreds of people anxiously await the survivors. He has no idea he's about to find much more than a simple story. He's about to find his own soul. The Carpathia docks when night has already covered Manhattan like a heavy blanket. Charles watches the survivors slowly descending the gangplank, some supported by nurses, others walking like ghosts, with eyes still lost in the icy waters that almost took them. He circles among them like a predator, searching for that perfect story, that person who will give him exactly what he needs. That's when his eyes meet Eleanor Dawson. She sits alone on a bench at the port, with a blanket over her shoulders and her hands delicately protecting her belly. Even in the twilight, Charles can see she's pregnant, and this immediately lights up his calculating mind. A pregnant widow, Titanic survivor. The story practically writes itself. Charles approaches with that professional charm he had perfected over the years. "Excuse me for bothering you, ma'am. My name is Charles Munro from the New York Herald. I know this is a very difficult time, but I'd like to know if you would have a few minutes to talk about your experience on the Titanic." Eleanor raises her eyes to him, and Charles is momentarily disconcerted by the intensity of that gaze. There are no tears, no desperation he expected to find. There's something much deeper, a silent strength that seems to pierce right through him. "Why do you want to know?" she asks with a soft but firm voice. "Well, people need to hear these stories. It's important that the world knows what happened, that we honor the memory of those who were lost." Eleanor smiles, but it's a sad smile, full of wisdom that Charles can't decipher. "Do you want to honor the memory of the dead, or do you want to sell newspapers?" The question catches him by surprise. Most people were flattered by press attention, eager to tell their version of events. But Eleanor seems to see right through him, through his carefully disguised intentions. "Both," Charles responds, deciding on honesty. "But mainly, I want to tell your story. I imagine it must have been very difficult. I can see you're expecting a baby and you think that makes my story more sellable?" Eleanor interrupts, but there's no anger in her voice, just deep sadness. Charles feels his face grow warm. "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant." Eleanor slowly stands, adjusting the blanket over her shoulders. "You see a young pregnant widow and think, perfect, this is the tragedy that will touch hearts and sell 1,000 more copies. But you don't see me. You don't see James." "James? My husband." Eleanor's voice becomes lower, more intimate. "He was an engineer. He worked on the Titanic from construction. He knew every bolt, every beam, every system of that ship better than any living person." Charles feels something changing in the conversation, a weight that wasn't there before. "And he was on the ship when?" "He was." Eleanor walks slowly toward the edge of the dock, looking at the dark waters of the Hudson. "James didn't die by accident, Mr. Munro. He died because he knew too much." These words make Charles completely forget his calculated journalistic tactics. There's something in the way Eleanor speaks, a quiet certainty that makes his reporter's instinct awaken in a different way, more truthful. "What do you mean by that?" Eleanor remains silent for a long moment, as if deciding whether she can trust him. Finally she speaks. "James told me things Things about the ship, about the lifeboats, about the decisions that were made. He was worried, Mr. Monroe. Very worried. Worried about what? About the fact that someone would die someday because of others' greed. Eleanor turns to face him directly. And in the end, that someone was him. It was him and 1,400 more people. Charles feels his heart racing. This isn't just a touching human story. This is something much bigger. Are you saying there were known problems with the ship? I'm saying my husband lost sleep for weeks before the maiden voyage. I'm saying he tried to talk to his superiors about his concerns and was told to shut up. I'm saying James Dawson died knowing he could have saved all those lives, if only someone had listened. The world around Charles seems to grow quieter. The distant voices of other survivors, the noise of traffic, the sound of waves hitting the dock, everything transforms into a distant murmur. He's facing something that could change everything. Eleanor, he says, and for the first time uses her name not as a tactic, but as recognition of her humanity. Would you have evidence of this? Any proof of what your husband discovered? Eleanor observes him for a long moment, as if weighing not just his words, but his soul. Do you really want to know the truth, Mr. Monroe? Or are you still just looking for a headline? The question resonates within Charles in a way he didn't expect. For a moment, he sees himself as Eleanor must see him. An ambitious young man, cold, willing to use others' tragedy for his own benefit. But there's something in this woman's silent pain, in the way she carries her loss with dignity, that makes him question his own motivations for the first time in years. I want to know the truth, he responds, and realizes that, surprisingly, he's being honest. Eleanor studies his face for a few more seconds, then makes a decision that will change both their lives forever. Come with me tomorrow. I have some of James's things that might interest you. That night, Charles can't sleep. He lies in his small boarding house in the Lower East Side, looking at the ceiling and thinking about Eleanor's words. For the first time in his career, he's not thinking about how to turn a story into a sensationalist headline. He's thinking about the story itself, the truth behind the facts, the real lives that were affected. The next day, he meets Eleanor in a small apartment in Brooklyn. The place is simple, almost Spartan, but clean and organized. On the kitchen table, she has spread a series of documents, letters, and technical drawings. James was meticulous, she explains, running her hand lovingly over the papers. He documented everything. Every concern, every problem he found, every conversation he had with supervisors. Charles leans over the documents and his breathing almost stops. They are detailed reports about deficiencies in lifeboats, correspondence about inferior construction materials being used to save costs, and most disturbing of all, letters where James expresses his growing concerns about the ship's safety. Look at this one, Eleanor says, pointing to a letter dated March 1912, just a few weeks before the maiden voyage. James wrote to the chief supervisor of the White Star Line. Charles reads the letter aloud. Mr. Thomas, I must again express my serious concerns about the insufficient number of lifeboats aboard the Titanic. Based on maximum passenger and crew capacity, our calculations show that, in case of emergency, we won't have resources to evacuate everyone aboard. I implore you to reconsider this decision before it's too late. And what was the response? Charles asks, though he already suspects the answer. Eleanor takes another letter, this one with the official White Star Line letterhead. Mr. Dawson, your concerns have been duly noted. However, we remind you that the Titanic was designed to be unsinkable, making your evacuation concerns unnecessary. We recommend you focus your efforts on your designated responsibilities and leave safety decisions to those in superior positions. Charles feels a mixture of anger and disbelief growing in his chest. They simply ignored the warnings. Worse than that, Eleanor says, taking another document, they threatened him. Look at this letter, sent just 1 week before departure. The third letter is even more disturbing. Mr. Dawson, it has come to our attention that you have been sharing your concerns with other crew members. We want to make clear that any attempt to create panic or publicly question company decisions will result in your immediate dismissal and assurance that you will never work in the maritime industry again. The Titanic will depart as scheduled, and we expect your full cooperation. Charles raises his eyes from the documents to find Eleanor watching him intensely. Now you understand, she says softly. James didn't die in an accident. He died because powerful people decided that profits were more important than human lives. If you're following this story so far, leave a comment telling me what you think Charles should do with this information. His choice will determine not only his future, but the future of how the world remembers the Titanic. Charles spends the following weeks immersed in a deeper investigation than anything he had ever done. He's no longer hunting for a sensationalist story, He's hunting for the truth. And the more he discovers, the more frightening the truth becomes. Through contacts and a lot of detective work, he gains access to more internal White Star Line documents. He discovers that James Dawson wasn't the only one expressing concerns. Several engineers and officers had raised questions about the ship's safety, from the quality of steel used in construction to inadequate crew training for emergency situations. Even more disturbing, Charles discovers evidence that the company knew they were taking calculated risks. In a documented internal meeting, an executive had said, "The cost of additional safety equipment exceeds possible compensation costs in case of accident. The probability of disaster is statistically insignificant." They had literally put a price on human life and decided that 1,500 lives were worth less than their profits. Charles works day and night, compiling evidence, verifying facts, building an irrefutable case. Eleanor helps him, providing context and details that only someone close to James could know. Gradually, a genuine friendship develops between them, based on mutual respect and a shared goal: seeking justice. "You've changed," Eleanor observes one afternoon, while they review drafts of the article Charles is writing. "When I met you at the port, you were just another vulture after a sensationalist story. Now I see someone who truly cares." Charles pauses in his writing. "James was important to you. These people who died were important to their families. How could I treat this as just a story? Many would do exactly that. Maybe I would have been one of them a few weeks ago." Charles looks out the window, watching life continue its normal course on Brooklyn's streets. "But meeting you, hearing about James, seeing this evidence, it changed something in me. I can no longer pretend that people are just characters in my stories." Eleanor smiles, and for the first time since he met her, Charles sees genuine happiness in her eyes. James would be proud to know his death wasn't in vain, that someone is finally going to tell the truth. Charles works feverishly on his final article. He knows he has only one chance to do this right, one opportunity to expose the truth before it gets buried under layers of political influence and corporate power. He writes with a passion and precision he had never experienced before, each word carefully chosen, each fact meticulously verified. The title he chooses is simple but devastating: "They Knew, and Let 1,500 Die." The article is a masterpiece of investigative journalism. Charles systematically documents how the White Star Line ignored safety warnings, cut costs on vital equipment, and silenced employees who tried to speak out. He presents James's letters, internal documents, and testimonies from other survivors that confirm the pattern of negligence. When Charles finally takes the article to his editor, he's nervous but confident. This is the kind of journalism that really matters, the kind that can change the world. But his editor's reaction isn't what he expected. "Monroe, what the hell is this?" The editor throws the manuscript on the table as if it were contaminated. "You were supposedly writing a human story about the Titanic, not a declaration of war against one of the world's largest shipping companies." "But this is the truth," Charles insists. "I have all the evidence. I can prove every allegation in this article." "Truth?" The editor laughs bitterly. "Do you think truth is what sells newspapers? Do you think truth is what pays our salaries? The White Star Line spends thousands of dollars on advertising with us every year. They have political connections that go all the way to Washington. And you want me to publish something that will turn them into our mortal enemies?" Charles feels the world crumbling around him. "So you're just going to bury the story? You're going to let them get away with it?" "I'm going to do what's best for this newspaper and for everyone who works here, including you." The editor stands, walking toward the window. "Rewrite the story. Focus on heroism, human tragedy, lessons we can learn. Leave aside these conspiracy theories. They're not conspiracy theories. They're documented facts. They're dangerous accusations that could ruin this newspaper." The editor turns to face him. "Monroe, you're a good journalist, but you're still young. You still don't understand how the world works. There are certain truths that are too inconvenient to be told." Charles leaves the office in shock. All his life, he believed journalism existed to expose truth, to hold the powerful accountable, to give voice to the voiceless. But now he's discovering that even the press has its limits, its own invisible chains. He returns to Eleanor with a heavy heart, carrying not just his rejected article, but also a new bitter understanding about the world he lives in. "They refused to publish it," he tells her, throwing the manuscript on the kitchen table where it all began. Eleanor doesn't seem surprised. "I imagined this might happen. How can you be so calm? This means they won. That the truth about James, about all those people, will die with us." Eleanor walks to him and gently places her hand on his arm. Charles, you did something nobody else did. You listened. You believed. You honored my husband's memory in a way I could never have done alone. But it wasn't enough. It was enough for me. And it was enough to change you. Eleanor smiles sadly. Sometimes doing what's right doesn't bring immediate rewards. Sometimes, you have to have faith that truth will find its way, even if it takes longer than we'd like. Charles looks at the documents spread over the table, all the carefully collected evidence, all the meticulously documented truth. A dangerous idea begins to form in his mind. What if I published independently? What if I found a way to get this story to the public, even without the newspaper's support? Eleanor watches him carefully. It would be very dangerous. You saw how they treated James when he tried to speak. Do you really think they'd treat you differently? Maybe not. But at least I would try. And if something happened to you? If they silenced you the same way they silenced my husband? Charles considers this for a long moment. Then, with a determination that surprises him, he responds, then at least I would have died trying to do what was right. Eleanor remains silent for several minutes, studying his face. Finally she speaks, there's a small print shop in the Lower East Side. The owner is a friend of my father's. Maybe he would print some copies of your article as pamphlets. You would do that? Even knowing the risks? James died because he tried to do what was right. If I don't help you continue his fight, then his death really will have no meaning. In the following days, Charles and Eleanor work in secret. They refine the article, organize the evidence even more convincingly, and make contact with the small print shop. The owner, an Italian immigrant named Giuseppe who had lost a cousin on the Titanic, agrees to print the pamphlets secretly. Charles plans a careful distribution. He'll deliver the pamphlets to other journalists, politicians, community leaders, anyone with enough power to amplify the story. It won't be as impactful as a front-page headline in the Herald, but it will be a start. The night before the planned distribution, Charles and Eleanor meet one last time in her apartment. The atmosphere is tense, both knowing that after tomorrow, their lives may never be the same. I have something for you, Eleanor says, handing him a sealed envelope. It's a letter James wrote to me the night before we departed. He had a bad feeling about the trip. Charles opens the envelope with reverent care. James's handwriting is clear and elegant. My dear Eleanor, if anything happens to me during this voyage, I want you to know I tried to do what was right. I tried to protect the people aboard this ship, but my voice wasn't heard. If I don't return, promise me you'll find someone who will listen, someone who will tell our story. The world needs to know there are people willing to stand up for truth, even when it costs everything. All my love, James. Charles finishes reading with tears in his eyes. He knew. He knew. Eleanor wipes her own tears. And now you're the person he hoped I would find. You're the one who's going to tell our story. That night, Charles barely sleeps. He reviews the pamphlets one last time, checks his contact list, mentally prepares the arguments he'll use to convince people to take the story seriously. He's nervous, but also more determined than he's ever been in his life. The next morning, Charles leaves his apartment early, carrying a briefcase full of pamphlets and evidence. His first destination is the New York Times office, where he hopes to find a braver journalist than his own editor. He never gets there. Two men in dark suits approach him just 3 blocks from his boarding house. They don't identify themselves, don't show badges, but there's something in their posture and the way they speak that makes it clear they're not common criminals. Mr. Monroe, says one of them, his voice polite but threatening. You need to come with us. Where? Who are you? People who represent important interests. People who prefer certain stories not be told. Charles tries to run, but the men are faster and stronger. They force him into a black car that was waiting at the corner. As the vehicle drives away, Charles sees through the rear window one of the men collecting the pamphlets he dropped during the struggle. And then Charles Monroe simply disappears. Eleanor waits for him in the apartment for hours. When he doesn't show up, she goes to the boarding house where he lived, only to discover that nobody has seen him since early morning. She searches hospitals, police stations, anywhere he might be. But Charles Monroe is never found again. The New York Herald publishes a small article about the young journalist who disappeared, suggesting he may have suffered an accident or decided to leave town for personal reasons. No mention is made of his investigations about the Titanic. Eleanor, devastated but not surprised, makes a difficult decision. She collects all the documents, all the evidence, all of Charles's article drafts, and carefully stores them in a wooden box. Then, with a heavy heart and the baby growing in her belly, she leaves New York forever. She settles in a small town in upstate New York, where nobody knows her as the Titanic widow. There she raises her son, a boy she names James Charles in honor of the two men who tried to do what was right. Years pass. Eleanor never remarries, dedicating her life to raising her son and keeping alive the memory of her husband and Charles Monroe. She tells the boy about the father he never knew, about the brave journalist who tried to honor his memory, and about the truth the world wasn't ready to hear. When James Charles grows up and becomes a man, Eleanor gives him the box with all the documents. Someday, she tells him, the world will be ready for this truth. And when that day comes, someone from our family needs to be there to tell it. James Charles marries and has children of his own. The box passes from generation to generation, like a family secret, a sacred responsibility awaiting the right moment. Now, in 2025, more than a century after the Titanic tragedy, a young woman named Grace Monroe, Charles Monroe's great-granddaughter, although she didn't know it until recently, is cleaning the attic of her recently deceased great-grandmother's house when she finds a wooden box hidden behind an old trunk. Grace is a journalist, just like her great-great-grandfather, though she works mainly online, creating content for blogs and social media. When she opens the box and sees the yellowed documents, old photographs, and a carefully preserved manuscript titled, "They Knew, and Let 1,500 Die," she initially thinks she's found some kind of historical fiction project. But the more she reads, the more she realizes it's not fiction. The documents are real, the evidence is convincing, and there's an attached letter, written in delicate feminine handwriting. To whoever finds this box, my name was Eleanor Dawson. My husband James died on the Titanic trying to save lives. A young journalist named Charles Monroe died trying to tell our story. If you're reading this, maybe it's finally time for the truth to come out. Eleanor Dawson, 1954. Grace spends entire days immersed in the documents, verifying facts, confirming details through online research. To her surprise, many of the names mentioned in the papers appear in historical records. James Dawson really existed and was a Titanic engineer. Charles Monroe really was a New York Herald journalist who mysteriously disappeared in April 1912. But most shocking of all is when Grace discovers, through online genealogical records, that Charles Monroe was her great-great-grandfather. The man who disappeared trying to expose the truth about the Titanic was her own family. Grace faces a dilemma. She could simply keep the documents as an interesting family curiosity. After all, more than 100 years have passed. The people involved in the original conspiracy have been dead for decades. What difference would exposing the truth make now? But then she thinks of Eleanor, a young pregnant widow who guarded these secrets for decades, hoping that someday someone would have the courage to tell them. She thinks of James Dawson, who died trying to save lives. And she thinks of Charles Monroe, her own blood, who disappeared because he refused to let the truth be buried. Grace makes her decision. She digitizes all the documents, verifies every fact, and creates a complete multimedia presentation of the story. But instead of trying to sell it to a major media outlet remembering what happened to Charles, she decides to use the power of the modern internet. Grace publishes the complete story on her blog, with the original title Charles had chosen, Titanic's Lost 1912 headline that stopped America. She includes photographs of the original documents, transcriptions of the letters, and a detailed explanation of how the evidence reached her. The story spreads like wildfire. Within hours, it's being shared thousands of times on social media. Titanic historians begin examining the evidence and confirm its authenticity. Journalists from major outlets request interviews. The world is finally hearing the truth that Eleanor and Charles tried to tell more than a century ago. The revelation causes shock waves through the historical community. Although the White Star Line ceased to exist long ago, the story forces a complete reevaluation of the Titanic disaster. Museums update their exhibitions, history books are revised, and for the first time, the general public understands that the tragedy wasn't just a terrible accident, but the direct result of corporate greed and criminal negligence. Grace receives thousands of messages from people around the world, thanking her for bringing the truth to light. Families of other Titanic victims share their own long-guarded stories. The official narrative of the unsinkable ship that met its fate by pure chance is finally replaced by the much more complex and disturbing truth. But perhaps the most touching response comes from an elderly woman named Sarah Dawsonchin, who lives in Seattle. She sends a private message to Grace. My great-grandmother was Eleanor Dawson. She told me about James and about a brave journalist who tried to tell the truth. I always wondered if it was just a story she invented to comfort me about losing my great-grandfather. Now I know it was all true. Grace and Sarah correspond for weeks, sharing family memories, old photographs, and pieces of the story their families had kept separately for more than a century. They discover that Eleanor really had kept a copy of everything, passing the story from generation to generation in the Dawson family, just as had happened in the Monroe family. Eleanor always said that someday the truth would be told, Sarah writes. She died in 1987 at 97, still waiting for that day. I wish she could see this. Grace decides she needs to do one last thing to completely honor the memory of everyone involved. She uses the genealogical information Sarah shared to locate Eleanor's grave in a small cemetery in upstate New York. It's a sunny spring day when Grace finally visits the site. The grave is simple, with a modest headstone that simply says, Eleanor Dawson, 1890 to 1987. Beloved wife, devoted mother, guardian of truth. Grace places a bouquet of flowers beside the headstone and kneels on the grass still damp with morning dew. Eleanor, she whispers, we did it. Charles did it. The truth was finally told and the world listened. The wind blows gently through the cemetery trees, making the leaves whisper as if in response. Grace stays there for a long time, thinking about the extraordinary chain of events that connected her life to people who died decades before she was born. When she finally stands to leave, Grace feels a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. She understands now that some stories are bigger than a single person, bigger than a single generation. Some truths are so important they refuse to die, passing from heart to heart, from family to family, until they find their moment to be heard. In the months following the story's publication, Grace receives an unexpected invitation. The Maritime Museum in Southampton, England, the city from which the Titanic departed for its only and fatal voyage, wants to create a special exhibition about the untold story of the Titanic. They ask Grace to loan the original documents and help curate the exhibition. Grace accepts, but with one condition. The exhibition must include not just the story of James Dawson and Charles Monroe, but also Eleanor's story, the woman who guarded the truth for decades, and all the other families who suffered preventable losses due to corporate greed. The exhibition becomes one of the most visited in the museum's history. People from around the world travel to Southampton to see the original documents, read James's letters, and learn the complete story that was hidden for more than a century. But for Grace, the most significant moment doesn't happen at the museum, but on a quiet afternoon in her Brooklyn apartment. She's organizing the documents that were returned from the museum when she finds a letter that had gone unnoticed before, a letter Eleanor had written but apparently never sent. The letter is addressed to the family of Charles Monroe, wherever you are. I write this letter knowing it will probably never be read by you, but I need to put it on paper. Charles Monroe was more than just a journalist who tried to tell our story. He became a friend, someone I could trust during the darkest days of my life. When I met Charles, he was an ambitious and somewhat insensitive young man, interested only in getting a good story. But something changed in him when he heard about James, when he saw the evidence of what really happened. He transformed into someone who cared more about truth than his own safety. Charles once told me he had spent his whole life thinking only of himself, his career, his reputation. But learning our story made him realize that some things are more important than personal success. Some truths need to be told no matter the price. He knew he was taking a risk by trying to publish the story. I warned him. But he told me, Eleanor, if I don't do this, who will? If I don't defend James and all those people who died, who will defend them? I want Charles's family to know he died as a hero. Not the kind of hero who appears in newspapers or has statues erected in his honor, but the rarest and most valuable kind. Someone who did what was right even knowing it could cost everything. If this letter is ever read by his descendants, I hope they feel proud of Charles. I hope they know he found something greater than himself in the last days of his life. And I hope they understand that, although his voice was silenced, his courage inspired others to never give up on truth. With love and eternal gratitude, Eleanor Dawson. Grace finishes reading the letter with tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she fully understands the weight of the heritage she carries, not just the documents and evidence, but the legacy of courage and integrity that Charles Monroe left for his family. She digitizes the letter and adds it to the online story, along with a personal note. This letter was found among Eleanor Dawson's documents, never sent, but finally delivered to its intended destination. Charles Monroe, my great-great-grandfather, you were not forgotten. Your courage lives through all of us who choose to tell difficult truths, no matter the cost. The addition of the letter generates a new wave of attention for the story. More people share, more families of Titanic victims reach out, and the narrative continues growing and evolving. But perhaps the most profound impact of the story isn't in headlines or social media. but in the quieter conversations happening in classrooms, dinner tables, and offices around the world. Teachers use the story to teach about the importance of investigative journalism. Parents share it with children to talk about moral courage. Young journalists are inspired by Charles Monroe's example to pursue difficult truths in their own careers. The story becomes bigger than its original characters, transforming into something universal, a reminder that truth, even when buried for decades, has a way of finding its path to light. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to do what's right. And that sometimes justice takes more than a century to arrive, but when it does, it's worth all the waiting. Years later, when Grace is already a recognized journalist specializing in human interest stories, she often thinks about the unlikely chain of events that led her to that box in the attic. If Eleanor hadn't kept the documents, if Grace's family hadn't maintained the great-grandmother's house, if she hadn't decided to clean the attic that specific day. But then she remembers the words Eleanor had written in her never-sent letter. Some truths are so powerful they refuse to remain buried. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe it was what was always meant to happen, truth finally finding its way home. And on a quiet night, when Grace is working on her next story, about a nurse who exposed dangerous conditions in a local hospital decades ago, she feels the presence of all those who came before her. James Dawson, who died trying to save lives. Charles Monroe, who disappeared defending truth. Eleanor Dawson, who guarded that truth until the world was ready to hear it. She's not just telling a story. She's continuing a tradition, honoring a legacy, keeping alive a promise made more than a century ago. Truth, Grace realizes, isn't just about facts and evidence. It's about people brave enough to defend it, generation after generation, no matter the cost. And that's a story that never really ends, it just finds new voices to tell it, new hearts to carry it forward. The Titanic sank more than a century ago, taking with it 1,500 precious lives. But the stories of these people, the truth about their deaths, and the legacy of courage left by those who refuse to let that truth die, these things are unsinkable. They live forever, passing from one generation to the next, reminding us that, in the end, truth always finds a way to rise to the surface, no matter how deeply it has been buried in the icy waters of silence and forgetting.